I didn't understand I was unlocking the worst rules lawyer in history.
Structure makers.
So the commander brackets came out recently, and we did an episode about them specifically, but it got us thinking about what we were hoping that the brackets would solve, but ultimately didn't. So the thing we're talking about is implicit versus explicit rules.
Which we thought we did a video on already, but apparently we didn't.
Even if we have, I think there's more to talk about here now that the brackets have come out. First, let's talk about what each of those two things are. What are implicit rules and what are explicit rules? We'll define them. And then we'll talk about how what that means for Commander, I guess. Impact this has on the brackets, but then also things to think about for game design in general.
Explicit rules are basically the actual rules of the game, the written down, defined rules of the game.
This is what's in the rule book. This is what's written on the cards. It's pretty cut and dry, right? It's just these are the rules of the game.
I know. I kept thinking I was missing something.
No, that's it.
It's like, no, that's actually that's it.
the explicitly stated rules of the game, how you play the game, etc.
The implicit rules are usually a socially constructed form of rules decided outside of the written rules of the game. So if you sit down for, let's say, a game of Commander, and people are like, hey, don't play more than 3 board wipes, that's an implicit rule. That's not something that the game is saying that you can or cannot do. That's something that your group is deciding on.
Often these are just seen as like social norms, but also they can be different based on what type of a group you're playing in. So let's talk about the brackets themselves for a minute and how they have codified some implicit rules, or at least attempted to. In brackets 1, 2, and 3, there's a few sections that mention things that are implied rules. Things like something that's saying like few tutors or no 2-card combos before late game. And those things they're defined in an article that's outside of the bracket graphic, but they also can mean different things to different players. And that's when we start to move into like implicit rules land. And it's not to say that like you can't have implicit rules. It's just that when you do, you're opening yourself up for misinterpretations between players.
Right.
So when we say something like late game, it's defined, I think, as turn 6 or 7, I can't remember which.
Something like
that.
But
6 or 7 or later. But the problem is that turn 6 or 7 does not look the same every time. So when you define something that way, a play group might say, well, we're a slower group, so we actually don't want the game to end until turn 12 or whatever. And you're leaving the door open for the players to interpret the game in whatever way that they want to. That might be the advantage of implicit rules, is that players can customize the game in a way to their liking. But then when you get outside of that play group, that's when you start running into problems.
I think that, the big issue that we're seeing with brackets is that it's explicitly saying be implicit in certain areas. And a lot of the times, very similar to D&D, right? That there are explicit rules in D&D for the Dungeon Master that basically say, like, if this doesn't work the way that you want it to work, that's okay. Like, make it work the way you want it to work.
I think
in a way,
the rule of cool is like the ultimate implicit rule, right?
Right.
It's like, just do whatever's cool in the moment, whatever's better for the story.
And I think that for D&D, that can work. It's a lot more difficult for something, especially something that started as a more structured 1v1 game like Magic, to now be introducing this sort of codified implicity with their rules.
Yeah, I think the part of the reason why this works for D&D is because you have someone at the table who has final say, right? It's the DM. So they are the ultimate authority in whether an implicit rule is good, is like fine or not, right? Where in Magic, everybody's on the same level. So like you're sort of trying to come to a consensus, right? And there's nobody who can point to something and say that's okay or not, right? So you have this conversation at the beginning of the game and you're maybe thinking that you're all on the same page, but then as the game goes on, sometimes you weren't on the same page and your interpretation of what something means is not the same. Some of the brackets mention 2-card combos, no 2-card infinite combos. Well, there's some gray area even there in, okay, well, is a 2-card infinite combo that doesn't win you the game not okay? Or is it something like Orvar, Whim of Olrath, Cloud of Fairies? Is that a 2-card combo? Is that a 3-card combo? You technically need your commander in play for it to work, but it's only 2 cards after that point. So you could probably say it's a 3-card combo, but some players might perceive it as, well, you're combining 2 cards to do that thing, right? Orvar happens to be in play, but these other 2 cards that you're combining are what's allowing you to do it. But then at that point, right, you're past this point of sort of consent, I guess, where at the beginning of the game, you're sort of not understanding all of the implication of these implicit rules. Then when you get into the game, things might not line up the way that you thought they would.
So explicit rules, those hell of a lot easier to structure. It's very clean. However, there's still issues with it, which is that obviously if the explicit rules don't account for everything, you also can't police everything explicitly, right? So technically, it is not against the rules of Magic to lie.
Well, sort of. It's against the rules to misrepresent the board state.
Sure.
But it is not against the rules to lie about hidden information. Right?
And the misrepresenting of the board state, that actually came after, well, I think it's always been kind of a thing, but it changed after the Baborigmos Enraged incident. There was a player at some sort of a tournament that basically ended up saying that they target Baborigmos. It was calling out a particular card, but the other player then said, well, you said Baborigmos, not Baborigmos Enraged.
Yeah. I actually got a game loss for this.
Really?
Yeah. I had in my deck.
You weren't at a pro tour.
I was at a PTQ.
Well,
so Pro Tour qualifier.
Yeah.
You have to register your deck, right? When you sign up for the event, you have to write every card down and how many copies of it. In my sideboard, I had one copy of Chroma, Angel of Wrath, which I think is the white one. I just wrote Chroma, and at that point in time, there were 2 Chromas. There was Chroma Angel of Wrath and Chroma Angel of Fury, I think is the red one.
You were cheating.
Yeah. I got a game loss, and that was my 2 losses for that match, and it was also my second lost match for the tournament. So that ended my tournament.
Oh my god! But technically, that's an explicit rule.
Yep,
that is an explicit rule.
So I guess what we're saying is the explicit rules have an inherent disadvantage because they don't make a lot of room for gray area, right? Which can be amazing when you're trying to deal with people that like to, have to play to the edges of something, to play to the extremes. When you have gray area, it allows for people to push those edges, or even just room for misinterpretation. But when you have no gray area, you have stuff like that, for instance, where someone had clearly meant one thing but didn't actually say exactly the thing, and they were punished for it.
Right. And I think that some players are going to abuse that and call that out. And then other players, there are going to be players for sure that will take it to the most extreme. And that's where you're going to see the extent of your explicit rules. And this is why you see all the time in various sports or whatever, you see like various small rules, different flags thrown and stuff like that. It's because over time, they've had to sort of construct these rules in a way where they're like, well, people weren't playing the way we wanted them to play because we didn't write enough explicit rules.
There's also something that came up in the CEDH community not that long ago, which was a player who had lied about what they had agreed to do. I think it was somebody asked them, well, are you going to win on your turn if I let you do something? And they said no. My man. And then they won. Yeah. They went ahead and did it. And everybody got really mad about this because the implicit rule is that you don't lie in CEDH. And I'm like, there's nothing...
I lie all the time. Are you kidding me? At a casual table at CEDH, I don't care. I'll lie.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Someone will ask if I have cards in hand. I'll be holding up a whole hand of them and say, no.
Well, that's misrepresenting the board state. You can't.
It's not on the board. Explicit.
Oh, my God. I didn't understand I was unlocking the worst rules lawyer in history.
Nah. But too shy to ever do that at a tournament.
But seriously, so this player lied effectively, and then backtracked a bit on it because they said like, oh, I didn't know I was going to draw this card or something like that. But none of that really even matters, right?
Doesn't matter.
Somebody could ask you, hey, are you going to win in your turn? You say no, and then you do. Doesn't matter. There's no, as long as you're not misrepresenting the board state, you did not violate any rules of the game, right? You may have violated social norms, but those aren't codified in the rules, so them's the breaks, right?
And it's funny because I think that this was so divisive, I think, in the CEDH community, because there's a lot of people that play casual Commander but watch CEDH, and then there's a lot of people that just play CEDH and watch CEDH. And I think the majority of people that play CEDH were kind of like, well, yeah, those are the rules. Like, you don't have to...
there were a lot of people that play CEDH that were like, why'd this guy lie?
Oh, well, those people are silly. I don't know.
I was like, guys, what?
Because to me, that's the beauty of CEDH, right?
Yeah,
it's just
bluffing.
the explicit rules.
Right.
And if bluffing, hidden information is part of the game, then... yeah, why would you... It's like telling someone what your morph is. It's like you play a card with morph, and it's
like imagine you in 1v1, right? You attack your opponent with your mana untapped, and they go, "Are you going to play a buff spell? Are you going to buff your guy? If I block him, are you going to
before I commit to the spell that I want to play as a reaction?
Yeah, you're going to do that, and you go, no. And then they're like, okay, and then you do it anyway? What? Like, what are you talking about?
It doesn't make any sense. I understand how it can rub people the wrong way, but also, like, that's just part of the game. You can't have bluffing and then not have lying. Like,
right. Yeah, it comes with the territory. Okay, cool. So what do we think are some takeaways for game designers to sort of wrap their head around implicit and explicit rules?
I mean, really, once the game is in the player's hands, you can't decide on the rules.
Right. You're not there anymore to say this is how it's supposed to go.
And this happens often, right? We'll play quite a few different games from our Discord and stuff. And there's a lot of times that someone will have to be like, well, no, you have to do this with your cards, or you have to do this with this and whatever. And if that's not a written rule, if that's not something that's written down, it's important to watch what players are going to be doing. Right? Because if it's not explicitly decided on, someone's going to try and abuse that system. Sometimes that might be to do something more intuitive. Sometimes it's just to abuse, whatever the limits of the rules are.
Yeah, I think that's really important. When you're creating the explicit rules for your game, you have to create them for the extremes of the system. Right? Yeah. You have to think about these edge cases and ways that these rules either could be misinterpreted, either accidentally or purposefully, to get some kind of inherent advantage.
Yeah.
Playtesting is a huge factor in all of this, right? Where this, especially playtesting with all different kinds of players, right? Casual and competitive alike, to see, this just isn't quite clear enough to a more casual audience. They're not they haven't internalized a lot of the same kinds of rule structures that maybe you as a designer have. And then testing with competitive players so that you can see, these are the exploits of this system and why these rules aren't lining up with my intended experience.
It kind of reminds me of really early Magic, that there would be some players that they would play their mana up in front of the creatures and creatures in the back. And at a certain point, they had to decide, you can't do that, because players would kind of play above their creatures, and it would be distracting. It'd be hard to tell exactly how many attackers or blockers that you have. And they just had to decide, we just need to make it clear that this is where you're going to see all your creatures, that's where you're going to see all your opponent's mana, so that you don't get that mixed up.
Yeah, it was kind of that was always interesting to me. I started playing after it was the norm to put your creatures in front of your lands, but I definitely had played against players that played the other direction, where their lands were first. And I
played with someone just a couple years ago that did that, and I visibly winced. It was like,
yeah,
gross.
It feels off. And part of it is norms for understanding the board state. And then they ended up having to codify those into explicit rules about how you're supposed to manage your board state. But part of the reason why people would do it, I think, is because when they declared an attacker, they would move it on the other side of their lands, right? They weren't attacking with the creatures back here.
Yeah.
It was there's a dividing line between creatures that are attacking and not.
Which I could see.
Sure, it makes a certain amount of sense, but whoo boy, is it confusing.
Did they fix it because of Dryad Arbor?
I don't know. I can't remember exactly when this rule was changed,
I don't
have a tournament anecdote for when they changed it off the top of my head, but it was like 2010 or something. It was pretty. It was recent.
That would have been
a Dryad Arbor.
Because there was a tournament debacle that happened where someone ended up having a Dryad Arbor and they swung with it, but a player didn't recognize that as being part of the mana base, or being a creature or something.
Yeah, that could have been it.
Maybe.
Yeah. There was it probably had something to do with somebody cheating somehow.
Yeah.
It's usually how that works.
You're right.
So implicit rules, right? What's the takeaway for designers of the implicit rules? One, these are a bit more difficult to build into your game. It's not impossible, but you need to sort of develop an explicit system for managing implicit rules in the way that D&D does, where they have, the DM to decide what is ultimately okay or not. You could, theoretically in Commander, they sort of do it by committee. But I do think that the detriment to doing it that way is that, well, one, the moment of agreement on what's going to be okay in the game is done only once at the beginning of the game. Right. It's not handled throughout the game, other than, I don't want to play against that, and then not playing the game or like never playing with those people again. Right. And again, maybe that's another drawback here, is that like if your only means of enforcement of implicit rules is I'm not going to play with that person anymore, you're going to have a whole lot less people to be able to play against.
Right, which will technically still happen even in D&D, right? Someone can set a particular rule, or a DM can do a particular thing, and someone says, well, I don't like that, and doesn't want to play with them. But it does just make it significantly easier, I think, being able to go to a particular person and that person getting final say. It's funny because you actually designed this in with Bullets and Teeth and Aliens.
I did.
We haven't mentioned that in a few months.
It's coming. We're getting there.
But you have the bait card, and whoever has control of the bait card kind of gets final say. And so regardless of what other people are saying you should do or shouldn't do, you can still kind of make that final decision. And that's codified in the rules because of that.
That there's an explicit way to manage any kind of implicit actions that occur. Thanks for listening to talk about implicit and explicit rules. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And also you can join our Discord if you'd like to discuss anything we talk about on the channel further. And we'll see you in the next one.
Bye.
Bye. I guess that's it.
I know, I'm trying to think if there's I think that's an episode at least.